My name is Patsimo Wenzel. I'm the farm EDP here at the Truckee River Microfarm. We'll be teaching a short little workshop today. All cameras welcome, introducing people or reminding people how to tell stories either with their iPhones or professional cameras, film, or point and shoots. Yeah, what I really hope people are able to get out of today's workshop is kind of a reminder or some lessons in storytelling, a connection to kind of like the world that we're in, and giving people those storytelling skills so that way they are able to re-fall in love with telling stories, get reminded of how to tell stories, and then they're able to take those skills and share those and teach other people or remind other people how to tell stories and make sure that, you know, what they hope to convey comes across. I have a deep passion for photography. That's really one of my main reasons for doing this. And as a skill set here, you know, you'll find that a lot of the people that work here at Patagonia are incredibly skilled. And this is one of the few ways I am able to pay it forward and able to share my skill sets, and also as an invitation for other people that have different skills to know that they too can share, that they can put something on together like this and be able to share what they can do, share their love for things with other members of our team here in Reno. I think the main thing I'd kind of want to share is that as someone that's been a professional commercial and advertising photographer for over 15 years, I find that sometimes we get lost in the technical, where our gear matters or how-to matters. And I think the most important part is getting the story out. And a well put together story matters way more than technical competence. You can be completely competent technically and not able to tell a story, and I'm hoping that that's something that can be conveyed today. The main thing that I'm hoping everyone gets from this is that you get a reminder or you get some new lessons on how to do some storytelling, really establishing the why, and then we'll get into some composition and we'll get into some of the technical. But what I hope that you're able to leave with today is, you know, your reignation or your inspiration for storytelling, and your desire to kind of, you know, pass it forward and share what you're able to gain today or your excitement about storytelling today. So that way, you know, what you do, you know, when you're out and about, it's not just a knowledge piece that you have for yourself. You want to share it, and you go and you practice, which is the most important things. Anyone that doesn't know me, my name is Patsimo Wenzel. My middle name is Lucky. I'm from Kanye, Botswana. It's a little village in a little country in southern Africa. My first name means shining like the sun, so I kind of find that to be kind of a prophetic name for someone that likes photography and videography. I'm a farm EDP here. I'm a receiving merchandise processor inside, and I have been previously an environmental portrait photographer, commercial photographer for the last 15 years. If anyone doesn't know what an environmental portrait photographer is, that's a portrait photographer that documents people in their environment. It's a little bit different than a lifestyle photographer where it's set up, it's a formal portrait, and using the environment around to tell the story. But those skills can be used for everything from events to lifestyle to action shots. It just kind of gives you a compositional perspective. So same set of skills, just a different focus. I've had the chance to work with Patagonia's photo department on books, Patagonia Provisions as a photo editor, and on the Dirt, that one that we have published inside, the printed version, I'm the editor on that particular one. So I have a little bit of experience here and there. The ability to judge photos, I think, is a little bit different than the ability to take them. So I definitely am able to judge interesting photos that go to editing, but I may not necessarily be able to produce them the same way. The way we're gonna kind of do some kind of chat a little bit about storytelling, we're gonna get into some composition, and then we're gonna do the technical. As soon as we're done with that, we're gonna do practice, because knowledge is great. Practice matters more than anything else. You can know all the details of how to do something, but doing it over and over and over again matters. We are children of the sun. We have to process that. It can't just be in our heads. So kind of with that, the idea is the first thing we're going to talk about is the why you're taking a photograph and making a photograph. And the principal thing is it helps you figure out, if you're making a photograph or if you're taking a photograph. Does anyone have an idea what I might mean by that difference? What does that mean to you guys when I say the difference between making a photograph and taking a photograph? You guys can speak up.
Composition, I'm guessing.
Composition, yeah.
Making of a photograph.
Yeah, that's absolutely.
A little bit more thoughtful.
Yeah, I like that, yeah. Perfect.
Storytelling.
Yeah. Exactly, and those are all exactly right. But the reason that kind of matters, though, it also affects your expectations and how happy you are with what you produce. If you make a photograph, you might feel differently about what the quality is. Whereas if you take one, you might look at it differently. You might find yourself just as happy with a photograph that may not be technically what maybe other creators think is the best, but because the perspective is that you are documenting a moment, you're not necessarily creating that moment. So that's kind of the difference there. Whereas when you make a photograph, you tend to go, okay, where are we gonna be first? You're gonna look at the setting, that environment, where do you want the people to be? What's gonna be the differences in how people or the environment is working together? So that's the kind of the reason there. And the whys matter because what you end up considering is where they're going to live or who they're gonna be for. Are you taking a photograph to post on Instagram? That's gonna really inform how you take a photograph, and who your audience is will inform what pieces of your composition or what your subject matter is. You'll find yourself absolutely enthralled with like a child's portrait where they're dead center, big brown eyes, curly hair smiling at you, and the background is cacophonous and distracting, but you don't see it because you're capturing that moment. Whereas if you're creating something different and you're thinking, all right, this is going to be printed on a wall, or this is going to be a piece of artwork, you might look at it a little bit differently. The why does matter. Who it's for should be where you begin your process of making an image. If you're making an image, let's say for Patagonia, or you're making an image for the newspaper, your approach fundamentally has to be different. Who you're telling your story to changes kind of how you tell your story, and all of these things they really do tie into the technical components we're going to talk about here in a few moments. But those are the things that I want each and every one of us to always consider when we're kind of making something, is that the perspective and the reasons of why you're doing it really should be the things that kind of guide you that direction. That's kind of the format that you use to then put together your composition or your expectations when you are documenting or you're making your photograph. In composition, I think a lot of people get kind of tied into some of the rules. Is anyone here familiar with the rule of thirds? Yeah, it's one of those dead set rules. I hate it, and I respect it, but I really feel like sometimes we get dialed into that so much that we forget that it's just a moment in time. What a photograph does is that it takes a four-dimensional world, and this is what our world is. We have our 3D, and then we have time. A photograph takes those 4 dimensions and takes them down to 2 dimensions, right? It freezes time. It freezes that light, it compresses everything. Whether your hand is sticking out this way or that way, it's flat, it can't tell, all right? And that whole idea is that if you understand that, you can kind of get your composition set up so that way you understand that you're not documenting kind of reality. You're making a new piece of artwork. You're holding time still. When you do that, keep in mind that images are made by getting your character as your primary focus, and that's the thing that you're going to be considering. So we talked about who your audience is or who it's for. Composition then comes down to two main things, which is your primary character, who is going to be what is going to be the main focus. You can't get a decent photo without a primary focus. And then the other really important thing that I think a lot of people forget about, and just as important, is your supporting character. Can anyone tell me what they think I mean by supporting character?
Like a picture of a bridge, but then the scenery in the background would be the supporting character.
Absolutely, yeah. That's exactly it. It gives you that perspective. Yeah, that's primarily it. You can have the same pose of a person, but if you don't have anything else in the background, you really can't tell that story. And that's really what you're playing with most of the time, is that dichotomy between your primary character and your supporting character. That way, you don't have to worry so much about, is this person slightly off to the left and up, so that way they hit those lines just right? You know, you're worried about, okay, how does my main character contrast with my supporting character? One of our colleagues, Cole from Dealer Services, recently posted a phenomenal photograph. Most of the photograph is just like a granite wall, and it ends, and then he's got a climber, another climber, you know, on the side of it. And that was just a phenomenal example of getting your place set. He could have taken the same photograph from a different perspective, and it wouldn't have given you the same dynamicness. You could tell that was a straight up and down rock face we're climbing, and it gives you just a more exciting feel. So that's kind of the other components of your composition. And the last little piece of composition that you always want to worry about are lines. And if you have those three things put together, watch out for straight lines. Our brains follow them. We can't help it. So regardless of how perfect you may have your supporting and your main character, if you have lines that are leading you somewhere else, it's going to be distracting. And that's kind of, you know, why some people like me like to use a lot of negative space. Anyone have an idea what I mean by negative space in a photograph or in a video? No?
It's kind of like the hollow.
The hollow, yeah.
Like kind of where things want to naturally go to.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I think in my mind is an area where there isn't over amount of information to take your attention. It gives context. It gives scale. Those are the kind of the fundamental things. So when let's say you're making a photograph for a Nike ad, you notice that a lot of Nike ads will have a lot of negative space because they want you to concentrate on what they're doing, and then they have space for copy. Whereas if you have an Instagram post, there's almost no negative space because they want you primarily focused on those main characters. Is anyone familiar with Helmut Newton? He's a famous fashion photographer, black and white. You have seen a Helmut Newton photograph. Think white background, black and white photo, female model, and just like a phenomenal like outfit. When you have a photograph where it's all white and you have a character, where do you guys feel like who is the main character in like one of those fashion ads?
Clothing.
Huh?
Clothing.
Nailed it, yeah. That's exactly it. The models are always the supporting character in those. Whereas when you're doing something like maybe an advertisement for, you know, like a doctor, the person is the main character. So that kind of dynamics can change things up. All right. And understanding kind of like the reasons you're making a photograph and your compositional kind of maneuvering to be able to accomplish your why from your composition. This is when you get to use the technical skills to be able to achieve those things. The main things in photography is that photography is dead simple. A lot of us like to try to make it really complicated, but there's kind of three things you want to remember is that it's all about light and controlling light. The primary thing that we kind of start with is your ISO, which is how sensitive your film is or how sensitive your sensor is to light. That's kind of a thing that we can change or not change depending if you're shooting on film. If you're shooting on film, you get one set of sensitivity and you adjust your shutter speed and your aperture from there. But that's all ISO is. If anyone has an iPhone or they have a Samsung, it gives you an option for ISO. It makes it brighter or darker. But just like anything else, you know, if the ISO is really high, that means that's lots of light. It can make it kind of a muddy thing. Lower, it can make it high contrast. But that's something that you know, when you're thinking about your composition, when you're thinking about your why, you want to consider how bright the whole thing wants to be. So that's the kind of the first part and the fundamental part of the mechanics of photography is your ISO. The next thing we're talking about is shutter speed. That's that part that takes that four-dimensional world into two. It stops time at that moment. And how long it stops time for is the real thing that you're looking for. If the shutter is available to the light for a long time, that means that that light reflected back will be available to be sensed for a longer time. If the shutter speed is faster, that means that light for any movement is not available for as long. Does anyone have any questions about these small parts here yet? I think we're all simpatico. Awesome. And the last two things are going to be your aperture, and the aperture is simply how open the lens is to light. So the smaller the hole, the more things are in focus. That's right. So the tinier it is, the less amount of light it is, the more things are in focus. The wider it is, the less things will be in focus. And you can use those tools like to use that for negative space. If you want to be able to see the subject behind, you will use kind of a tighter aperture, a higher number. So like an f-stop of like f16 or f10. That will give you more things in focus. If you want fewer things in focus or you want more bokeh, you want to lower that. That also means if you're shooting a subject, they're gonna fall out of focus at some point. And the last part is the length and the focal length of your lenses. And those are also components that you want to consider when you're considering how you're gonna put together your image and how you're gonna compose it. A wide angle is gonna show more of the world, but that also means that things that are closer will gonna look larger, or things that are further will look smaller. A long lens will pull more things into that tube. The physicalness of it brings what it has here and tightens things together. That's why you'll see people photographing something where they want to bring in the background in, so it's closer to the person. You'll use a longer focal length, 90 millimeters to 200 millimeters. Where if you want to see more of the scene and you want your subject to be primary, or you want the scene to be larger, you'd use a wider angle lens. Am I kind of giving you guys some basics on how the mechanics of your photography? Awesome. And then I think the last part that isn't often talked about is the sensor size or the film size and how that behaves with light. The larger your sensor is, the more information it can collect. Just purely physics. I know that light's one of those things that doesn't seem like a physical thing, but it absolutely matters. If you have a larger sensor, that means that each of those photons has more space to provide information. So even if your megapixels are lower on a large sensor, the quality and texture of your images will be different. That's why sometimes you'll see an iPhone or a phone camera with a high pixel count, but the sensors are small. That means that there's more information has to be fit into smaller spaces. That can make a difference in kind of like the performance of your image. Even though you have all the pixels, you don't necessarily have all the information, even though something else may have a lower pixel count. Does that track with everyone so far? Awesome. I think that's going to be this part of that, because I want to be able to see if we can get into a little bit of practice. When we get into practice, I want you to consider those things. Do you want movement in your photograph? How bright did you want it to be? Which perspective are you taking when you're photographing something? If you're looking at me from right here, the light is right here, you're seeing me dynamically different because I don't cast shadows than what he's gonna see me from over here. He's got a kind of a dark side, light side on me from where his perspective is. Keep those things in mind when you're creating. Keep in mind how much negative space you wanna have when you're kind of making a photograph. Watch for your leading lines, but most importantly, consider what your primary subject is and who your supporting character will be in creating a photograph. before we get out to get into practice and shoot around, are there any specific questions we want to cover before we kind of break things up a little bit? No? Yeah. Everyone pretty much knows the ins and outs of the cameras. What kind of cameras did everyone bring today? iPhone. What kind of images are you trying to make, man?
Something really pretty.
Okay, yeah. No, I like that. Oh, sorry guys, I totally forgot it to cover color and the whole thing. That's just a part of the composition thing, yeah. So keeping that in mind, like, yeah, consider things like color and how that plays across, right? If you're gonna take a photograph, if you have it in color or even black and white, what your saturation is gonna be like, what your light is gonna be like is gonna change kind of how that goes through. What about yourself? You brought your iPhone today?
Yep.
And what are you trying to gather today?
Something really specific, something that somebody else hasn't maybe seen before. And
Oh, I like that, new perspective. I dig it. What do you think?
Pictures?
Take some pictures. No, I get it. How about you, Javi?
I don't know. I want to be in it. So,
There you go. So you want to be the subject. We can be your supporting characters, right?
see, yeah,
There.
Joe can be my supporting character.
Hey, this is good. No, that's perfect. But do you feel like you've gotten anything that will help you, be able to do that better? I mean, I've seen your photos; they're fantastic.
No, yeah. I mean, I didn't get lost, but like in the ISO and like the aperture part,
Yeah.
I was like, isn't that the same thing? Because if it's like, if the hole's bigger, that's how much light it's gonna capture or let in.
Yeah.
Isn't that what the ISO does?
Yeah, and same thing as shutter speed.
Okay, so yeah, right.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I don't know which one should matter more.
Absolutely, yeah. And so I will kind of break it down like so. How much light it lets in for if your f-stop is higher or lower, that also changes what's in focus too. So it is still how much light it lets in, right? Same thing with your shutter speed. How much light it lets in. If it's open for longer, it'll let more light in. But the other side of that is how much motion will you get, or how stopped will it be? Your ISO, how much light it lets in, how bright it will be, but it also changes the quality of your image, the contrast of your image. So you're kind of always playing with a little bit of negotiations with light, but it's not purely about brightness, it's about the affect of how that light comes into your two-dimensional world, because in the end it is taking it down to a two-dimensional world. Yes.
I would be really curious to know, like, if you were shooting manual, like, what would you pick for your ISO today, and like, what would you pick for your f-stop and your shutter speed? Like, I would be curious to know, like, what settings you would put in for the environment that we're in.
That's a great question. Yeah. So come on through. Yeah. Oh yeah. So for a time like this, like, I start with my why at the beginning of that, right? Because before I start messing with my settings, I have to know what I'm photographing and why I'm photographing it, right? I can make this scene dark with my ISO or whatever I want. If I'm photographing someone, let's say, outdoors, and I want to make sure that the environment around them is also visible and they stand out a little bit more, I would adjust my ISO to match this light. The lowest ISO possible in this kind of environment, because it's bright, we have enough light. I feel like if I want some shallow depth of field, I can have a lower ISO. If I want more things to be in focus, I may have to make that compromise that I have an increased ISO, or I get film that's sitting at like a 400 or 800 ISO, or maybe not 800, but 400 ISO. So that way I have control of the other two things, because that's the negotiation you have, especially if you have a fixed ISO like you do in film cameras. That's the first component. So if I want an environmental portrait where that space is visible, that's where I start. I typically in a space like this, I would probably want everything to be stopped. That's the image I'm trying to create if I don't want motion in that. So, the negotiation is going to be at, a 1/200 of a second exposure will stop everything I need. Any handshake from me, any movement from the camera shouldn't come across if you have a faster shutter speed. And the main part of the composition I'll use to get the storytelling components, to get the things I want visible, are gonna be my f-stop, my aperture. What is in focus? How much of the scene is in focus? Do I want you to be able to see everything in detail from Javi down to that truck? Or do I want the capacity of it to kind of disappear at the flowers behind her? So does that answer your question a little bit there?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's a great question. Any other questions? Especially phone ones, because I feel like the phone ones are kind of the ones where you want to kind of play around a little bit. iPhones in particular, and a lot of Androids do something for you that sometimes you want to be able to turn off, and that is that it does HDR, the high dynamic range. It's shooting 3 or 4 or 5 images all at once, either at different shutter speeds or different ISOs. Typically, oh, you okay, Trey? Typically with phone cameras, their apertures are kind of set, and the changes that you make are purely software. So they're not really changing how open or closed that lens is. It's a set thing. It just kind of plays games a little bit.
So should we turn it off?
No, it depends on your why, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because the thing is that, like, we see in HDR, cameras don't. Like, we adjust on the fly. Like the shadows in your face, I remove them. I try to make sure I can see a whole thing. Our cameras really are able to see kind of one exposure, and they don't process it on the fly. Our brains process things like that on the fly. So phones will process multiple exposures or multiple amounts of light at the same time to give you a view that's closer to what we see. So if you want to do something different, sometimes if you want to have a more contrasted image, you set your camera to a raw setting. And as we're going around, I'm going to be here so we can go into your camera and mess with your settings a little bit. So that way you can adjust how high contrast or how low contrast it is, and your spacing from your subjects, and especially if a multiple lens one. No? Any other questions at all? No? Sweet. The next part here is I want to be able to snap away and then do a little walkabout. We're gonna snap some photos here, and I want to break the teams up into kind of 2 sets of folks. Anyone that wants to be photographed and be documented and also practice shooting somebody else, we'll cut in kind of in half. And anyone that kind of wants to go and see if they can make some images of some flowers, we'll do it the other set. So I don't know who kind of wants to play with what at this point. Who's down for the flowers right here? All right, we got so it's the flower set. I want you guys to think about your why, where you want your image to live, who your audience is. Is it going to be you? Is it going to be the gram? And use that to be able to figure out what your composition is going to be, and play with different perspectives. I want you to play with different angles of the same subject. Try to find your primary subject and your supporting, and move about. Come closer to it. Pull back from it. See how you like your framing. The main thing you want to do is play with that composition to see what provides you what you want. Are you going to be shooting primarily horizontal images? If you're doing that and they're going to go on Instagram, you might not be as happy as if you have them vertical. But if you are sharing this on a different platform, you might want to have more horizontal images. And then anyone that's going to be shooting folks, we're going to dip in and out of different lighting situations so we can see how those affect you. We're going to use the garden's space to see how you can use the grapes over here as a negative space, or the hoop houses as leading lines. All right? Sweet. Let's get to it. And thank you for coming on, and let's start playing. Awesome. Yeah. But I think people were able to kind of get what they needed. There was quite a lot of details that kind of went in, and I think if I can simplify those a little bit, so that way it's about the practice. I wanted everyone to be able to shoot more, so that's gonna be my goal, is more time with cameras in hand, because that really affects things. And I think less concentration on the technical and more on the why and a little bit on the composition. So more why, a little on composition, less on the technical. Yeah, come through. Bring your iPhone. You got tools there. If you have a camera that you haven't been using, the idea is you want to be able to tell stories, and then we want you to come out and practice and shoot more, and so we can share it. Please tell your story. Get connected with the earth, get connected with the garden. We want to hear what you have to say.
Is that a thing